Well, thank you very much for such a very nice introduction. Of course, I'm extremely pleased. I'm very delighted and honored to be actually here among you. I have to say that the German translation that you can see here is actually the first translation of the book published in, in a language other than English, obviously. And of course, it is followed by many others, but I was extremely pleased how quickly the German translation was done. And of course, I was even more delighted by the reception of the book in German, Austrian, and Swiss papers. I would speak now, and the moderator will control me, because I know it's late in the evening, and of course, I'm sure there is more discussion, there are questions, so I don't want to sort of monopolize the time. So I will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes and try to wrap it up, even if I don't go through all the slides. And actually, I know that I will not because there are too many of them, but I will go, I hope, through the most important ones. So I will start with something which actually was mentioned before and which is a part of the book, but it's not the whole book. That's about within national inequalities. Now, within national inequalities are the inequalities that we are mostly concerned with because in our ordinary lives, we are normally citizens or of the countries, obviously, where we live, and we are most interested in inequality within nations. But of course, my book is about global inequality, but this within national inequalities plus between national inequalities are composing the total global inequality. So let me start with within national inequalities because there are certain things there which are quite known to many of us, but it's worthwhile just reminding ourselves of that. The first one is that generally speaking, as you can see here, this is what is called an unbalanced panel, which means the number of countries changes from year to year. And you see these spikes and so on. But if you look at the red line sort of has a bottom or about 1980 and then starts going up. So essentially we have had a period of about 30 years or maybe 35 years of rising within national inequalities. Now that was most clearly exemplified in the rise of the top. And we will see that in a minute when I actually talk about the effects of globalization. But it is worthwhile keeping in mind that a bulk of the increase in inequality within nations was really a very specific and interesting increase in inequality among the top 1% or 5%. In other words, what I want to say, that it was not that inequality within countries rose up sort of proportionately across the entire distribution. It rose very specifically at the top, and not that much action happened in the rest of the distribution. So you can also see that in the summary statistic, which I'm not going to read out, each line, but if you look at the top line, that gives you a number which is called the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality that ranges from 0 when everybody has theoretical value, when everybody has the same income, to 100 when one person has the entire income of a country. Now in real world, of course, the countries range between 30 and 60 on that metric. The world is at a number 70, but if you look at the top line, which says only the average Gini in 1988 and 2011, you see the increase from about 36 Gini points to 38 Gini points. So it is not a small increase because the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, it's like a little bit, it's a very sluggish measure. It's like a little bit watching, as they say, the grass grow. It doesn't change dramatically. So 2 or 3 Gini points change is not minimal. The same story is actually also displayed. You can do it on a graph where you actually, I have the same numbers essentially like which were in the previous slide, except that now they are put in a chart where the Gini coefficient around 1988 is on the horizontal axis and Gini today or 2011, because really these numbers don't come immediately, they come with a several years lag, is on the vertical axis. So one thing that you can actually see is that if the country is, and the country size is here reflective of the population, so the large dots are very large countries like China, which is divided into rural and urban, in India and so forth. If you're above the 45-degree line, you have had an increase in inequality. And you know, most countries have actually had this increase in inequality. But there is one exception, and it's worthwhile mentioning that. And these are countries with very high level of inequality, but whose change has been downward. So these are countries that you can see here, like Brazil and Mexico, that are very unequal countries, but they have become slightly less unequal. Now, we should not take this as, forget about the meaning of that. It still means that these countries are extremely unequal, and it means that at any given year, they're more unequal, obviously, than the US, and of course, many times more unequal than Austria, but they are becoming less unequal. But they are an exception, because everybody else, as you know, in OECD countries, out of 33 countries, approximately 27 or 28 have had an increase in inequality. Most significantly, US, Great Britain, Israel, and what is less known, Sweden. So these are the countries with very large increases, but everybody else basically also saw their inequality go up. And I often mention that point because people forget that although the US, the change in the United States is more extreme because the top 1% is richer, the top 1% gained more, the top 1% is actually extremely important even politically, it is an extreme along the continuum because most OECD countries also experienced an increase in inequality. And then if you go past OECD countries, then of course you have China, which had a doubling of inequality. You had Russia, probably with a doubling of inequality. Practically all the transition countries saw an increase in inequality. So it was a general phenomenon that we have witnessed. And it could have been, and actually there are studies related to the type of globalization that we had. Arguments are being made, of course, it was type of financially led globalization that also was responsible for such large increases at the top. However, I want to very briefly indicate, shown in one example which contrasts to Germany and the US, that to some extent globalization is not destiny, so that you do have a policy space. And I would focus only on two lines here. If you look at the red line, this is something which we call market or factor income, which does not take into account government redistribution. So that line, as you can see, both in the case of the US and Germany, is very strongly going up. The data go back to 1970. And even actually in Germany, that line is going more strongly up than in the US. So the underlying forces of globalization, technological change, and so on, clearly implied or drove inequality up. But now I want you also to look at the blue line. Now the blue line is level of inequality, which takes into account government redistribution through social transfers and direct taxation. And what you notice there is that the blue line, in the case of Germany, first, of course, is lower throughout than the blue line for the United States, which is not surprising because we know that inequality in Germany is less than the US. What was interesting is that the blue line increased relatively little in the case of Germany, whereas in the US, if you look at the blue and red line, you see that they are really parallel. So in other words, in the US, there were underlying forces which led to a greater inequality, but there was no offsetting government effect in the sense that actually the government became more redistributionist or had more progressive taxation or more progressive transfers. So in other words, it simply kept on reacting as it was doing in the past. In the case of Germany, you notice that actually the gap between the red and blue line became very large, implying that government transfers and direct taxation became more progressive. So this is one example, and I can actually give, and many people could give many others. In other words, whereas the OECD countries all experienced increase in inequality, the policy space was still open to some of them to mitigate that increase in inequality, to offset it, or even to reverse it. So we should not really see globalization as fate against which we can do absolutely nothing. Now, the growing inequality within nations obviously raises a number of issues that I've listed here. I'm not going to go over them. If we have the time, I would show you, for example, a little bit of the data about how the middle classes in practically all rich countries have become smaller, how the number of people that can be defined as the middle class has shrunk. And as you can imagine, and it was of course mentioned by Marcus in the introduction, it does have significant implications for democracy, because what is actually happening is polarization. And if you have polarization by income, it is not sort of unreasonable to expect that it might lead to polarization in political opinions and the support of different political parties and so on. So we might have sort of evisceration of that democratic middle, which goes together with the declining share of the middle class. Then the second issue is also that the perception of inequality in many countries has been different from the measured changes in inequality. Oftentimes, maybe that's the result of the social media, ability to know more about the incomes of the rich. So oftentimes the perception of inequality is even higher, or actually the perception of increased inequality is outstripping the actual measured inequality. Finally, one thing that I also mentioned here, and which unfortunately I cannot take into account when I show you the data for the global inequality, is the hidden assets of the rich. That has become, a real bigger and bigger problem as the time goes on, because obviously for reasons of avoidance of taxes or fiscal evasion, the rich are able to use free movement of capital to hide their assets. On some very simple calculation based on Zuckman's data, and of course, as Zuckman was here recently, you can make a calculation that approximately almost 1% of the world GDP in terms of income, not wealth, in wealth is much more, but in terms of annual income is probably received from the assets that are actually not being controlled by national authorities, in other words, from the hidden assets. So that's a very big contributor to also global inequality, which we cannot really take into account. Now, let me go very briefly now to between national inequalities and show you one slide, which, as I said, to people before, actually here in Vienna, before the elephant graph that became very popular, this was my most popular slide because it really sort of represents the world and the countries in the world in a new dimension, if you will. So what this graph does is it shows, I will start with the United States, it shows the position, your position in income distribution, let's suppose in the US, on the horizontal axis, and then your position in the global income distribution on the vertical. So in other words, if you're, let's suppose, somewhere in the middle of the US income distribution, which would put you at the number 50 over there, if I can get this, in any case, the number 50 over there, then you ask yourself, where am I in the global income distribution? And of course, knowing that the United States is a rich country, then you would actually expect that you should be above number 50 globally. The same would be true if you took a person with an average income, or actually a person with a median income in Austria, and asked him or her where he should be in the global. The expectation is that he would be above, obviously, 50 percentile globally because people in Austria are rich. So in the case of the United States, as you can see, the poorest people are somewhere around the 55th percentile, and then as you go up, you obviously become also richer, globally speaking. And the very top, you have this line, which is kind of flat at the very top, where you have about 12% of the richest Americans being part of the global top 1%. When we come to the West European countries, between 6 and 8% of population of those countries are in the global top 1%. And that also holds for Austria. But to see the diversity of the world is actually, you need to have more countries, obviously, put in the same framework. And here is India, although the data for India, for the reasons that are long to explain, are somewhat of an underestimate of of actual position of Indian population, they still are strikingly different, obviously, from the US data, and they illustrate the fact that something like 85% of people in India are below the minimal income in the US or in Western Europe. So there are extremely large differences in incomes of the countries, and not only in the mean incomes, but they carry over the entire distribution. And of course, it is not surprising that the bottom of income distribution in India, that number 1, is also at the bottom in the world. So we are not surprised by that, but we are surprised possibly by the fact how few Indians are actually above the US minimal income. Here is China. As you can see, again, you see actually poorest Chinese being among poorest people in the world, but you see the difference that there is an emergence, as we will see in a minute also, of what you might call global middle class, although these are people who would not be considered global class by Western standards, but because the world is very unequal, of course, they would be considered globally a middle class because the criteria or the requirements in terms of income for you being global middle class are less stringent than being middle class in a rich country. And here is the next country, is Russia, where you actually see the poorest people around the 40th percentile of the global income distribution. Again, you see the middle class, the people around 80th, 90th percentile in the world, and you also see that the top 1% of the Russian income distribution is in the global top 1%. Obviously, these distributions don't include, oligarchs and the others, but they include generally affluent people in Russia, as they include, of course, in China and elsewhere. And finally, the country which kind of mimics the world, because it has people who are among also the poorest in the world, it has significant middle class, and it has also people who are in the global top 1%, is Brazil. So this is sort of a very brief introduction and reminder of these large differences in income across nations. And of course, a more dramatic illustration of that is if you were to take a rich and very egalitarian country like Denmark and compare that with African countries which are very poor. Well, there you actually have almost no overlap, or actually you don't have any overlap, because even the very poorest people in Denmark, as you can see, are at something like the 80th percentile of the global income distribution. And then on the other hand, people who are in poor African countries are even the top 1% in those countries is below the level of the minimal income in Denmark. No, that does not mean, I have to explain that, it doesn't mean that nobody in Uganda is richer than somebody in Denmark. Well, I'm saying there is not enough of them to represent 1%, which could be 2 million people, could be 200,000 people or whatever, depending what is 1% of that nation, but there are not enough of them to be actually included here and to have sufficiently high income. So these issues of large differences in country incomes raise 2 points which we will not have time to discuss today, but I think that's why my book is here, so you can read that in the book. These are the issues of what I call the citizenship rent, with the very fact that by being born in a rich country, you receive something which is similar to a citizenship premium or rent, which is then similar to what you would normally get from being born to rich parents. But there is a difference in the sense that being born to rich parents is something that normally countries try to, equalize in terms of opportunities, not to let people who are born to rich parents necessarily inherit everything and become rich and not need to work. At the level, the global level, we don't have any instruments which would, of course, make redistribution between the countries. Now, I'm not calling for that particular redistribution. I'm just saying that we need to actually put that issue on the table, as political philosophers have done in the past, and to ask the question whether inequality of opportunities really matters only within nation state, or should it matter more broadly. And I think the European Union is a very good example, actually practical example, when issues like that are really being raised, I think, on a daily discourse or in daily matter. And then finally also the large gaps in mean incomes have obvious implications for migration and national welfare state. So let me then go do I have still on global inequality that I would actually review very briefly and hope to finish with the explanation of the winners or losers, so to speak, of the last 25 years. First, to give you a general introduction, is to give you an idea how did global inequality move in the last 2 centuries. Now, obviously, our data on that are much weaker than over the most recent period of the 25 or 30 years. But take them with a grain of salt, or maybe more than a grain, maybe like half a kilo of salt, but they would be there. The blue line shows you the Gini coefficient of the world, where actually, technically, each individual is taken into account in that calculation. So each individual comes with his or her income from the country where they are from. The data are from Bourguignon and Morisson. The blue series is not mine. The red one is mine with Christoph Lackner. So what it shows you is really rising global inequality from the Industrial Revolution until the end of the 20th century, and then a reasonably significant drop in the last 20 years. Now, what is behind that, and actually it's very intuitive but important to realize, that the increase which you see between 1820 and 1900 was essentially driven by the success and by the growing income of the rich countries that became rich, like North and Western Europe and Northern America and later Japan, and the fact that Asia, in particular China and India, remained at the same level of income. So think of the Industrial Revolution as a big bang, which actually set some countries on a trajectory to high income and high growth, whereas other countries, in particular large countries like India and China, stayed where they were. And what we are now witnessing, and I think we are quite an extraordinary witnesses to a really sort of geoeconomic change of really huge proportions, we are now witnessing in this red line a reversal of this process, in the sense that Asian countries are now becoming richer, their growth rates are higher, and as they become richer and become closer to the rich world, global inequality is reduced. So what is important there to realize that the global inequality really depends on 2 engines, as it were. It depends on the engine of growth, which means what happens to the growth of poor countries versus the growth of rich countries. And here we have had a period of 25 years of higher growth rates of large populous countries like China compared to the West. And it also depends to what happens within national income distributions. But historically, it is the engine of growth that has been more important than the engine of only within national distributions. And that is illustrated in this slide, which actually takes this global inequality and divides it into 2 parts, the ones that I already mentioned. The one within national inequalities, which I call class, and between national inequalities, which I call location. So as you can see here, in the 1850s, the 2 parts were about the same. But the rapid growth of the West and essentially stagnation in the rest of the world has made the location and really the key cleavage in explaining a person's income. So the red part really went up very significantly. And that's why I call it Frantz Fanon, because he was associated with his writings in the 1960s and of essentially seeing the world through the lens of the third world versus the West, because the main cleavage in income was precisely between the countries. But that may be changing now, as I said before, with the rise of Asia and with the recapturing of the economic position of Asia, or recapturing to what it was probably like in around 1500, where the differences in income between China and Western Europe were very small, that we will have now the decline of global inequality through the shrinkage of this red component, location, and possibly, if we don't stop growing inequalities within nations, then the class component, which is here the gray-colored, would rise. So if that were to happen, then we would go back to something which would be kind of a Marxist world, where the main cleavage is at the nation state between the rich and the poor, or between, as it was in the past, capitalists or workers, or peasants versus landlords, and so on. So it is a very interesting world, because we are moving to something which is both good, because we are reducing global inequality, but we are also moving to something where the cleavage within nation states can actually become much more dramatic than it used to be, like, 40 or 50 or 30 years ago. So then I will skip the technical issues. Let me just finish with how the world essentially has changed, if you will, between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Great Recession, because it so happens that actually the data that Christoph Lackner and I were using covered that period between 1988 and now actually with the new update all the way to 2011. And that was a very kind of handy to have the data over that period, because of the beginning really sort of was practically the same year as the fall of the Berlin Wall. Our data, of course, have nothing to do with that particular event, but they have to do something with general expansion of data on individual incomes from the 1980s, because we would not be able, and we cannot really do similar work for the period before. Or when we do it actually with much less information. So let me first show you, well, before I show you the changes, let me show you how global income distribution looks today, because practically nobody has an idea how global income distribution looks until you see these numbers. So this is the distribution. Now the first point is the point that I draw at $600 per day, $600 per year, which is like less than $2 per day. So this is basically the absolute minimum. It was the poverty line that the World Bank uses, and you have 10% of people below that line. So people who are on the left on that line are poorer than the $6 per year, per capita. So that would be the absolute poverty. So we have about 10% of people in absolute poverty, and the objective of that is to reduce it to 3%. That was part of the development, of the Sustainable Development Goals, to reduce it to 3% by 2030. So then we go to the next point, where we have actually half of the population on the left, half on the right, and that point is only $2,100 per person per year. So that's actually what is called the median global income. You will see where the Western countries fit in this picture. Then we move more to the right. We move to the global mean income, and that global mean income is about $5,500 per year per person. And you have 73% of the population below that level. Then we have here the position, the median person in the rich countries, which is the acronym here stands for Western Europe, North America, and Oceania, is somebody who is about $15,000 per year. And this is disposable income, which means after-tax income per person. You take the household income, divide by the number of people. And that person is richer or better off than 91% of the world population. And if you actually ask where are the poorest people from the rich countries coming, I took here the UK bottom decile, but there will be not much difference whether I took Austrian or German or any other. They actually are there at something like the 75th percentile. So in other words, the entire action which happens in the rich world happens in the top 25% of the global income distribution. So that's where the action for the rich world happens. Where the action for China and India happens, obviously, is much closer. It's around the global median and obviously below the level that we actually have here for the rich countries, even bottom income decile. And then we say, okay, how did global income distribution change between 1988 and 2008? And here we ask the following question. We put everybody on the global income distribution from the poorest percentile, which is on number 1, or the poorest ventile, which is basically number 5. Anyway, these are the people who are the poorest, to the richest people of that famous global top 1%, which is here at the number 100 at the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis, we say, on average, how did incomes change at each of these points of the distribution? And what you essentially see is that there were really large gains in percentage terms at 2 points of the income distribution. Around the median, where actually you have basically people from the resurgent, what Angus Madison called resurgent Asia, I called it, for simplicity, China's middle class. So you have large percentage increases, doubling, and actually in the case of China, most of these people actually had tripling or quadrupling of their incomes. And the second point is the point of the global top 1%, where you also had large percentage gains, if not doubling, but close to doubling. Now, it's also important to realize that this slide shows you the gains in percentage terms. And because the global top 1% has an income which is many times higher than the income of the Chinese middle class. If you were to show that slide in absolute gains, the gains at the very top would be, dramatically higher than the gains in the middle. And there is actually a graph like that in my book where you actually ask the following question, which is very similar to what I'm showing you here, but it gives you a different perspective. You ask the question, of all the additional income that the world has generated between 1988 and 2008, how much did it go into the hands of the top 5%? And the answer is about 45% of the additional income went there. So the picture that you see here is an accurate picture, but one has to realize it's an accurate picture where the gains are measured in the percentages, not in the absolute gains, because the gains at the very top were many times larger simply because these people started with much higher incomes, and then even if in the percentage terms they did not get as much, in absolute terms, obviously, they got much more than the others. But why this graph has also attracted quite a lot of attention is because we find around the 80th percentile, 85th percentile, as you have seen in the previous slide, we find there that there was very little real income growth. And that group is overwhelmingly composed of people from the lower parts of the income distribution of the rich countries. And if you look at them, the three countries stand out because of their population size and because they really did not have much growth in the bottom half of their income distributions. And they are United States with the growth over that whole period of something like, double digit, like 15 or 16% for the bottom half of the population. Japan, which practically had almost zero growth. And I actually think really zero growth. And then Germany with very little growth also in the single digits over that period for the bottom 50%. So these countries, in addition obviously to many transition countries, but I have to point out that this point here has about, it is 70% of people at that point are people from the old rich countries. So that point is, of course, very important because it really sends the message to some extent, and these are maybe the only thing that I would say which has some sort of political implication, but it is more, I think, developed in the book. It sends the message of that particular group being squeezed from one hand from the rising competition from Asia and from people with whom possibly they compete for the same jobs, whether through imports or through outsourcing, and who are paid actually much less than the middle class is paid in the rich world. But they are also squeezed very significantly from the domestic top 1%. So their position to some extent is quite unenviable because they're at the same time exposed to the competition from the other countries, but then they see in their own countries that the gains and losses of globalization or technological change were not evenly shared because the top 1% has done extremely well. So that's basically, of course, the main message of the graph. Although, as I said before, one should not forget that, and the political implications of the graph, one should not forget that these percentage gains, when translated in absolute gains, are really overwhelmingly realized by the global top 1%. And finally, let me just show what really sort of essentially happened between 1988 and 2011. This is the graph of the global income distribution. And what you notice there, if you compare that 1988 graph with 2011, you notice that in the middle, you have like a thickening of the middle. In other words, maybe for the first time in, maybe 100 years or maybe more, we don't have what used to be called by Danny Qua quite well-known economist, were called twin peaks of the world, where we had lots of people at relatively low income level, as you can see still in 1988, and then there was another peak of rich people who are really at the other end. Now you do actually see the first, well, maybe the beginnings of what will become a global middle class, and then you see that thickening in the middle, which is really quite dramatic for such a short period of time of, in this particular case, 23 years. So this is, I would like to end on this. This is quite, I think, hopeful note that we are having a change in the world, which leads to many more people not being poor, many more people joining something in the middle of the income distribution, becoming sort of the global middle class. But then on the other hand, we do have many problems raised by globalization, not only in the rich world, but in the rest of the world as well, which actually require the remedy of nation state. Because while our incomes are often determined globally, people who feel losers or feel unhappy with globalization, to whom they can apply, they can actually complain or apply only to national governments. So there is a little bit of a contradiction between our incomes being determined globally and means for solving the problems raised by globalization existing only at the level of nation state. So like many times in history, I think our message has to be mixed. There is a hopeful part and a very optimistic part, but there is, I think, one which is much darker and much more pessimistic. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to end for now here, and I'm sure there will be many more opportunities to actually discuss some of these issues today or maybe later. Thank you very much.